From the shadows of forgotten histories emerges one of the most unfortunate narratives of the Space Marine Legions, that of the Thousand Sons. Once recognized as the 15th Legion and led by their formidable Primarch Magnus the Red, this legion embraced a destiny that diverged sharply from their original predetermined path. During the climactic Horus Heresy, the Thousand Sons fell to the treachery of both Tzeentch and Horus Heresy. Tzeentch's influence seemed to shield the Thousand Sons from physical corruption and disintegration, which had plagued the Legion since near its inception. This was a profound crisis of mutation and de-evolution that would eventually best the Legion, if not taken care of. A phenomena that appeared to fulfill the capricious desires of their patron. Disturbed by these transformations, the chief sorcerer Ahriman invoked a potent spell which was intended to immunize the Thousand Sons against further warp-born distortions. And while the incantation succeeded, staving off the pervasive effects of the flesh change, it inadvertently reduced all the afflicted, non-psyker soldiers into nothing more than mystically animated suits of armor, barely sentient vestiges of who they once were. Only those imbued with formidable psychic powers were able to retain any true sense of cognition or self. All those who weren't would become not more than dust, bound to the wills of others. Today, significant segments of this once mighty legion exist as spectral warriors. This, along with the tragic saga of Prospero, their homeworld, further deepens the misery and toil that surrounds the once proud Thousand Sons. Once a celebrated world of unparalleled beauty and intellectual stimulation, Prospero was a refuge and a close-knit community of outcast psykers, which would have ideally sheltered them from prosecution. However, when the Battle of Prospero began and Imperial forces were deployed on the planet just at the inception point of the Horus Heresy, everything, including its ecosystems, were decimated. Its natural splendor obliterated, and almost its entire population wiped out from existence, leaving behind a ruined landscape that the Inquisition would later deem purgatus. However, the subsequent inferno scoured the planet with such relentlessness that its surface was transformed into a featureless expanse of black glass, marking an irreversible end to its former glory. In the vast records of Imperial history, few legions evoke as much unease or tragic fascination as do the Thousand Sons. Once noble warriors of the Imperium's Legio Astartes, they now serve solely as agents of Tzeentch, the god of change, manipulation, and sorcery. Though many legions betrayed the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, the Thousand Sons are uniquely defined by the widespread presence of psychic mutation within their numbers. However, these traits would not be acquired in damnation, but were there by design from the very beginning, as every current living member of the Legion is a psyker. That fact alone distinguishes them from all the other traitor legions, as in large part they shun brute strength and favor psychic warfare along with arcane knowledge, often waging their battles through sorcery and deceit rather than steel and fire, much unlike their kin in the World Eater's Legion. Their preferred weapons are not bolters, nor chainswords, but curses, hexes, and warp-born flame. In many engagements, their presence is signaled not by banners or battle cries, but by silence, followed by the collapse of reality's rules. The origin of this unnatural state that many of the non-living Thousand Sons suffer from can be traced back to an act of desperation, or perhaps hubris, by their most infamous figure, Ahriman. In the aftermath of their exile from Prospero, during the earliest phases of their fall to chaos, the chief librarian enacted the Rubric of Ahriman, a powerful and nigh irreversible sorcerer's rite. Its purpose was singular: to save the Legion from degrading mutations that were unleashed by their genetic code in something known as the flesh change. But the result was catastrophic, as every Thousand Sons Astartes who lacked significant enough psychic strength was reduced to naught but dust, their souls sealed forever within their suits of power armor. These warriors were now in essence hollowed and almost completely mindless, as they march on still haunted and animated by the echoes of the spell that saved many of them from damnation, while condemning others to a perpetual existence between life and death, a nightmare far worse than the one they had originally been forced to deal with. In contrast, the remaining sorcerers gained a further increased mastery over the warp, becoming even more terrible in their powers, arcane energies of destruction animated by chaos and directed by the Changer of Ways. Their father, Magnus the Red, is no less a figure of mystery and contradiction as the cyclopean giant with a copper-red skin tone, who is most well defined by his thirst for forbidden knowledge, which proved to be both his greatest strength and his undoing. Like his brother, was flung across the galaxy after the Primarch project was all but ended by the universe's worst mother, sending infants in incubation pods through literal hell. His vessel, if such was the thing that delivered him to Prospero, a remote world already shaped by a strong psychic influence. However, since Prospero was no ordinary world, as it was a rather isolated and veiled locale from the Imperium's prying eyes, allowed it to be a home for sorcery and exiled mystics, along with rogue scholars, humans who had actively chosen exile over persecution in the wider galaxy. Magnus was therefore raised not as an outcast, but as a prodigy, as he did not simply learn their teachings, he surpassed them, his mind a labyrinthian expanse of intellect and raw warp potential, reshaped their very understanding of sorcery, turning once fringe disciplines into a refined science of the soul. In time he would be raised not merely as a leader, but as a force unto himself. His mastery over the warp rivaled even that of the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite, but this was in large part due to his desire for pursuing forbidden truths, and Magnus would ultimately tear a hole into realms better left undisturbed. So began the slow, inevitable descent of the legion he had once proudly led. Yet the question remains, were they truly victims of fate, or architects of their own ruination? Perhaps the hand of a cackling god might have had more sway than previously thought into the history of a cursed legion, one not merely cursed by betrayal, but by the very gifts that made them exceptional. As the flames of the Great Crusade would go on to consume the stars, the Emperor of Mankind found his long-lost son, Magnus, the Crimson King, upon the glass-strewn throne of Prospero. By then, Magnus had already devoured all the accumulated knowledge of his adopted homeworld and its esoteric libraries. He had become a master of the psychic arts and an adept practitioner of every forbidden scrap of lore within Prospero. Everything each and every last psychic exile had brought into the world, Magnus had absorbed. To him, truth was not a doctrine to be obeyed, but a force to be mastered. And when the Emperor arrived, Magnus would not kneel in blind faith. He saw before him the one being whose psychic might would ever eclipse his own. In that moment, a rare alignment of ambition and purpose occurred. The father offered the command of a legion, and a son accepted. Thus, Magnus assumed leadership of the Thousand Sons, warriors crafted from his own genetic stock, and he joined the ranks of the Great Crusade. With the strength of his warriors and the force of his sorcery, he carved a path across the stars in the name of unity. To many worlds, the Thousand Sons brought enlightenment and liberation. To others, confusion and dread. But always they brought knowledge, and sometimes that would be too much. Yet beneath the surface of that grand campaign, tensions brewed, as the Imperium of Man was conceived not as a pantheon of God, but as a realm of triumph for reason. Its guiding principle was the imperial truth, a rejection of all things superstition, mysticism, and religious dogma. The Emperor's iterators carried this creed everywhere they thought, to every world they brought compliance to, stamping out all the cults and the divinations of old. But the contradiction at the heart of this doctrine was clear to Magnus, the Emperor himself. The embodiment of rationality was also the greatest psyker in the galaxy, and Magnus, his most gifted of sons, had built an entire legion upon this very paradox. As psychic phenomena surged across the Imperium, growing more and more frequent, alongside of its increasing volatility, the contradictions could not be ignored. Though the psykers themselves remained rather rare, compared to the population at large, their numbers were increasing at an exponential rate. These emerging powers defied rational classification, eluding even the most rigorous attempts at empirical analysis, and with every unexplained manifestation, fear would take root. It was at this point that the Imperium faced a question that it could not avoid. Should psychic powers be embraced as the next step of human evolution, or as a feared gateway into oblivion? To resolve this crisis, the Emperor summoned a conclave of Imperial scholars, commanders, and his highest-ranking officials, which were to include many of the Primarch, to the ice-covered world of Nicaea. There, at the council that would bear the planet's very name, both sides would lay out their arguments. Those who viewed psychic powers as dangerous, and indeed heretical, urged prohibition. Their concern was not merely metaphysical, but practical, as many believed that the warp was too treacherous, and that sorcery was an easy vector for corruption, and then it would be Magnus who would speak in the defense of the psychic arts. He, along with Jagatai Khan and Sanguinius, would be the primary members who opposed the banning of psykers, and Magnus would speak both charismatically and with a razor-sharp wit that would exemplify his intellect and his magnanimous rhetoric. The Crimson King would thereby address the council with clarity and conviction as he dismantled the opposition's arguments point by point, asserting that knowledge itself was not strictly evil, that its worth lay in how it was applied. To wield the warp, he claimed, was not an invitation to ruin, but a test of discipline. To deny humanity its potential out of fear was to place a blindfold on destiny itself. His defense swayed many, and for a moment, a gleaming, glorious moment, it seemed that the council might rule in his favor for the use of exploration of controlled psychic disciplines. But the final judgment did not hinge on rhetoric alone. The Emperor had enthroned his solemn authority and weight not only in the words spoken, but in the truth behind them. For Magnus had not merely studied the warp, instead he had bargained with its denizens, and this was despite the Emperor explicitly commanding him not to do so. This left the Emperor already burdened by the dangers he alone could not fully understand. He had warned his son, Magnus, who in turn had disregarded those warnings, and the trust between them had been fractured. In the end, in no small part due to the Space Wolves' intervention and hypocrisy, the verdict was cast, and the use of psychic powers, and particularly, most of all, sorcery, was to be strictly forbidden amongst the legions of Astartes. The Librarius Division, which had been the pet project of Magnus the Red, Sanguinius, and Jagatai Khan, would be disbanded. Magnus here had not just lost the argument, but the Emperor's very favor. What followed set the stage for one of the Imperium's most grievous betrayals. A rift, not merely of the mind or philosophy. What had begun as doctrinal change would eventually become dogma. Following the Council of Nicaea, the Emperor's verdict was clear. The use of psychic powers would be bound under unbelievably rigid limitations, with all forms of ritualistic invocation and arcane practice, along with combat sorcery, outlawed entirely. For the Thousand Sons, whose martial and philosophical identity was inseparable from their psychic disciplines, this decree was a blow of suffocating finality. Magnus the Red, proud, brilliant, and now wounded, was outraged. The tools that had once won him victory time and time again were now condemned as heresy, in no small part to the ideals of two of his brothers, Mortarion and the Wolf King, Leman Russ. Outwardly, the Great Crusade marched on, but beneath the surface, deception festered. Magnus did not comply. Instead, he withdrew from scrutiny and continued his arcane studies in secret. The pursuit of forbidden knowledge did not falter on his part, but rather it intensified, as the Thousand Sons, once champions of enlightenment, were now viewed with deep suspicion and disdain. Amongst the Primarchs, none harbored more contempt for Magnus than Leman Russ of the Space Wolves. To Russ, war was a matter of strength, honor, and direct action. He saw Magnus's sorcery as treachery in slow motion, guile masquerading as genius. Even after Nicaea, the divide between the legions deepened into an open secret of smoldering hatred. Then would come the breaking point. In the shadowed hours before the full revelation of Horus's outright betrayal, Magnus experienced a psychic vision unlike any before. The veil of time and space was torn asunder, and he was torn from his mind's eye. He saw the future unfold, legions at war, Primarchs turned against one another, worlds burned in the name of ancient gods. He witnessed the Ultramarines misled, drawn from the heart of the conflict, and above all, he saw the Emperor isolated, betrayed, and vulnerable. But for all his might, one truth eluded him, his own place in the catastrophe to come. Magnus then made a choice, to warn the Emperor at all costs, and to do so he would commit an act that in itself violated every sentence of Nicaea. Knowing full well the cost of the act, he charged in headlong, proud as always. Using his prodigious psychic might, rather than any form of communication, Magnus projected his essence across the warp, bypassing all mortal distances, and shattered the psychic seals surrounding the Imperial Palace. His spirit crossed the threshold of the Emperor's sanctum forcibly to deliver his warning, and in doing so, he exposed a far greater danger. For within that breach, something ancient stirred. The psychic shock of Magnus's intrusion tore a rent through the defenses guarding the Emperor's greatest secret undertaking, the Webway Project. This immense endeavor was an attempt to create a human-accessible pathway through the dimension that the Aldari knew as a webway, and the stable pathway was completely destabilized in a single moment, and this damage was so catastrophic that the demonic forces were able to surge through the breach. The gateway to Terra was now compromised, and the Emperor's judgment was immediate and absolute. The order was given. The Space Wolves, the Emperor's executioners and lapdogs, were dispatched off to Prospero. Officially, their task was to apprehend Magnus and bring him to the throne world to answer for his transgressions. But the reality of what would happen would be far bloodier, as the War Master Horus, already corrupted and conspiring against the Emperor, manipulated the mission's intent by merely telling Leman Russ that the Emperor instead wanted Magnus dead, and under his influence, the Space Wolves fell onto Prospero at the first chance they had to enact their judgment onto their brothers, not as emissaries of justice, but as predators sent to kill. What followed was not the sanctioned arrest, but rather a perversion of a direct order from the Emperor, one which would lead to an annihilation. The very burning of Prospero was not an execution, it was an extinction-level purge. The Thousand Sons fought to preserve their world, their legacy, their truth. But against the wrath of Fenris, backed up by the Sisters of Silence, the most formidable force that directly answered to the Emperor, and Valdor's own cadre of custodians, even they could not stand unbroken. The minds of gods are not for mortals to know or to judge. Accept that Tzeentch has a place for all of us in his grand scheme, and be happy in the part that you have to play. This was attributed to Magnus the Red. When the Council of Nicaea had settled and the writ of the Emperor was handed down, there remained only one path forward, compliance or consequences. Magnus the Red chose to see a third path, the so-called City of Light. Sika, once the pinnacle of psychic inquiry and arcane architecture, it had stood as a defiant jewel within Prospero, that is, until the Space Wolves arrived. Brother turned against brother in a climactic siege where savage clashed against scholar. The feral fury of Fenris unleashed upon the mystics of Prospero, and for a time Magnus had lowered the shields, believing this was his penance for his mistakes. However, at the crescendo of the devastation, Magnus and Russ met blade to blade, as the battlefield bore witness to a conflict that was as much ideological as it was physical. At the end, Leman Russ, an embodiment of raw martial force, broke Magnus's back upon bended knee. Yet at the brink of his defeat, Magnus uttered a single, shrouded word. In that instant, both he and the ruins of Zika vanished from the physical realm. What followed defied natural order. Magnus transported his shattered legion and their broken home into the Imperium itself, and from the ashes of Prospero emerged something new within the Eye of Terror. On a world named Sorcerers, the planet of the Sorcerers. Even before their fall, the Thousand Sons had struggled against a corruption known as mutation, an inheritance of the Primarch's own perilous, unstable genetics. Rigid discipline and ceaseless gene purification rituals had once held the degradation at bay, but their immersion into the raw forces of chaos stripped away any and all safeguards, and mutation surged unrestrained. The Legion began to unravel before the very eyes of those who adored it so, its warriors devolving into monstrous parodies of themselves. Desperate to halt this ceaseless decline, a cabal of senior sorcerers, led by Chief Librarian Ahriman, devised a solution, a ritual of staggering power designed to strip the Legion's physical corruption and preserve their minds and strength. Magnus, who at this point had become increasingly withdrawn and consumed by bitterness, offered no resistance or even guidance. From his obsidian tower, he looked outwards, as the cabal proceeded without sanction or reprimand. Thus was the Rubric of Ahriman, and the warp itself answered. The skies above Sorcerers split with an etheric fury. Warp lightning clawed down from the rolling heavens, striking every battle brother one by one, as the spell unfolded with terrifying precision, bypassing psychic souls and targeting what it saw as the flawed flesh of non-psykers. But salvation gave way to horror. For those not highly attuned with the warp, the cost was absolute, as their bodies were rendered to dust, incinerated within their sealed power armor. What remained was not liberation, but imprisonment, as now soulless automata, bound to suits of ceramite, yet animated by the force, not of will, but of the Changer of Ways' own damnable skills. The rubric did indeed halt mutation, but at a devastating price. When Magnus emerged from seclusion, he beheld what had become of his sons, and at this he offered no wrath, no immediate vengeance. Instead he turned away, ascending higher into his silver tower, and cast a gaze not upon his legion, but upon the Imperium he once sought to preserve. His dream, his pursuit of enlightenment, and even his desire for mastery of the warp had been turned to ashes, and to this day it is said that Magnus broods still, his true self unreachable within the highest spire, his sights sweeping across the stars, while he schemes, his sorcerers now leading the Rubricaire across a galaxy, enacting the will of Tzeentch in 1,000 subtle campaigns against the Imperium. Each incursion, each incantation is but a fragment of a plan only one being may fully comprehend. It is said that even to this day, periodically Magnus the Red will appear in the Imperium to either carry out his own grand designs and schemes, much like his new patron, or to attempt to get revenge on his brother by proxy through attacking the Space Wolves, or even to duel against his brother Guilliman. The knowledge of sorcery is like seawater. The more one drinks, the greater the thirst, and the more inevitable the poison. This quote was attributed to a space wolf. We now return to the beginning, before Prospero, before Magnus, before the Rubric. The tale of the Thousand Sons does not begin in the stars, but beneath the clouded skies of old Earth, Terra herself, amidst the resurgence of the warp-born unrest. It is here, during the closing days of the Unification War, that the 15th Legion was conceived. In a rare and troubling phenomena, the Sol system at this time had been racked with brief but violent warp storms, psychic flashpoints that targeted and ignited multiple segments of the world across Terra's surface, heralding a wave of madness, violence, and self-terminations. While the precise connection between them and the Thousand Sons remains unknown and unproven, it was under these circumstances and these conditions that the gene seed of the 15th Legion was first conceived. Years later, Magnus the Red, newly reunited with his sons, would learn of this timing and consider it a dire omen. The Legion's earliest aspirants, referred to in recovered data fragments as student aspirants, were selected not from the devastated war zones of Terra, but from a region formerly known as the Achaemenid Empire. This territory had weathered the unification wars with minimal damages, having submitted to imperial rule early on, nearly a century prior. The emperor himself personally visited the region multiple times, accompanied by a retinue of servants and gene scientists. Every family in the area was tested for compatibility with the nascent 15th Legion's genetic code. Amongst those found suitable were Akez and Primarch Ahriman. Those who were selected would be relocated to the Himalayan mountains, into deep gene laboratories controlled by the nascent Imperium. There, the transformation from man to Astartes began. Upon their emergence, the first duty of the Thousand Sons was not to conquer empires amongst the stars, but the cleansing of the last remnants of defiance upon Terra. Their performance was swift, brutal, and rather effective. It was said that the name Thousand Sons was granted to them by the Emperor himself, and perhaps it was not merely symbolic, as records suggest that exactly 1,000 Astartes were initially created and trained before the Legion was expanded to full strength. The reason for this precise number remains unknown, but its reputation throughout the Legion's history, particularly in their darkest moments, suggests an ominous pattern, as if fate or something deeper had etched the number into the very soul and core of the Legion. The first 1,000 were not simply warriors, as it seems that from the outset the Legion's nature was set apart from its peers. While all Legions bore characteristics derived from their gene sire and their culture, the 15th was profoundly shaped by an intrinsic affinity for the arcane. Psykers, rarities amongst most Legions, barring two, were not anomalies within the Thousand Sons, but rather the norm. Theirs was a culture of scholarship, occult practices, and structured mysticism. This reliance on psychic powers would mark the Legion as one rather fierce and beyond normal measure. It would also make them highly suspect and instill upon a few legions a profound, almost biological hate. The Imperium, then still in its nascent golden age, tolerated sorcery only so long as it remained useful. In time, the same arts that made the Thousand Sons invaluable would also provoke censure, fear, and retribution. But in the early days, the Thousand Sons were not yet damned, neither by fate nor by their kin. They were the Emperor's chosen scholars, warriors of the mind as well as the sword, carrying his light into the darkest corners of the galaxy. Their destiny, however, was already moving against them, far beyond the heart of the Imperium. On the galactic fringe, where the light of Terra had long since dimmed, there lay a world chosen not for its beauty. This was Prospero, originally a barren sun-scorched husk orbiting a faded star. Prospero was devoid of natural appeal. It was isolated, scarred, and by all conventional standards, inhospitable. But it was precisely these qualities that drew its earliest settlers. These were not conquerors or colonists, but rather outcasts, mutants, psykers, and the psychically attuned, who had been pushed to the fringes of humanity's expanding reach, fleeing persecution and the fleeing wrath of a fearful humanity. They sought a refuge where they could live, study, and evolve in peace. On Prospero they had found it. At the center of this forgotten world rose a marvel, seemingly out of place amid such desolation: the city of Zika, also known as the City of Light. Built atop the planet's most prominent mount, Zika was an architectural marvel and the revelation of white marble towers, radiant spires, and pyramidal libraries, alongside luminous obelisks, all which stretch outward into the skies above. It thrived through techno-psychic energies and subterranean hydroponics, designed to sustain a people who lived not by brute force, but by intellect and arcane mastery. Here, the traditions of psychic study matured into elite disciplines, structured, revered, and crucially secret. Amongst these seekers of knowledge, one figure would stand apart: a child not born of the world, but delivered onto it. Over time, this being rose from a curious prodigy into an unrivaled master, and his name was Magnus. From the beginning, Magnus the Red displayed abilities beyond comprehension. His intellect and his psychic talent were vast, along with being set apart due to his towering body, which would be considered tall even amongst giants. Under the twin sons of Prospero, he became a scholar, a protector, and a philosopher king. His evolution was not merely a personal journey, but one mirrored by Prospero itself. As he grew, so too did Zika flourish into a beacon of learning and psychic discipline. Then, in a moment foretold by dreams and visions, a presence emerged from the void. This was the Emperor of Mankind. Radiating golden light, he stepped upon Prospero's soil, and what transpired that day has never been recorded in full. Some say there were no words, only mutual recognition between a father and son. Others say a battle of ungodly psychic might happened within the Imperium. A test, if you will. What is known for certain is that Magnus acknowledged that he was one of 20 lost Primarchs, and his origin confirmed his destiny. In that moment, the tapestry of the Thousand Sons Legion was in essence completed, as the 15th Legion, already marked by an extraordinary psychic potential, had found its progenitor. Magnus would then swiftly take command of those who bore his gene seed, and with his guidance, their powers would intensify greatly. What had been rare amongst Astartes had become almost commonplace. Sorcerers, scholars, warriors, all shaped in Magnus's crimson image. Thus, the Thousand Sons truly became his legion, not only in flesh, but in mind and spirit alike. But beneath the brilliance of Prospero's towers and reunion, a question remained. Was Prospero merely a sanctuary, or rather, was it a testing ground? Did Magnus rise to power, or was he always meant to be found? This is a paradoxical nature that follows the Thousand Sons, even to this day. Are they merely victims of fate, or was there a greater architect in their downfall? Are they truly free men and free thinkers, or like slaves, do they obey